Developed by the studio Cold Symmetry, Mortal Shell's influences are fairly obvious in the footage seen so far. As seen in the trailer and described by Cold Symmetry, the player begins the game as what is quite literally a soulless husk. Little is known about the empty vessel, although its purpose in life is quite clear. A husk must do the bidding of the Dark Father, an omnipresent dark force presiding over the world. Without knowing the aim or the objective of the Dark Father, the player is sent blindly into the world. The world of Mortal Shell, much like Dark Souls, is dark and decrepit. After humanity and civilization, the world is overrun by dead and dark creatures at every turn. Players must then work to harvest resources offered by these husks, taking the energy of lost warriors and turning it into something useful. Little is known about the story of Mortal Shell, but what we do know is that the player's husk is sent off to track down the last remaining hidden sanctuaries in order to find followers of the Dark Father. As if that wasn't ominous enough, the player, at least in the beginning stages of the game, must do this all without knowing the purpose of the Dark Father. Regardless of this, one can probably infer that someone with such a name and such dark arts at their disposal is far from being a heroic entity. As a soulless and empty husk, the main character is ready to absorb the gifts of other creatures littering their path. As the player defeats enemies along their journey, they gain the ability to, quote, take on their shape. The full extent of this power is unclear, although it is said that the main character will be able to absorb abilities and learn their enemies' knowledge of weapons. This seems to build upon the Embered state in Dark Souls 3, which only boosts your health for single-player purposes. Basically, the gameplay loop seems to be that of Dark Souls here. As the player defeats more enemies, more diverse abilities and knowledge will be granted to them. FromSoftware hit the big time with games such as Demon's Souls, Dark Souls, and Bloodborne, spawning an entirely new genre that has been immortalized. These games have stood the test of time and lived on as infinitely replayable games, and for good reason. They're extremely difficult. It would seem that some gamers are simply gluttonous for punishment, or rather just simply refuse to back down from a challenge, and FromSoftware's games certainly do provide that, as even experienced Soulborne fans can spend hours fighting bosses they've already tackled previously. It seems that Cold Symmetry seeks to use this formula as a base for Mortal Shell, and surprisingly, they seem to be one of the first experienced game developers to do so. FromSoftware's games worked hard to develop non-linear gameplay that simply plots the player into a dark and mysterious world. Players may figure out the lore of the game as they go on, or they may not. How invested the player gets in the actual world of the game depends on their playstyle and whether or not they want to read through hints placed around the world, or from the optional NPC dialogue. This type of gameplay is designed with many different playstyles in mind, as some players just want to get down to the nitty-gritty boss fights instead of sitting through cutscenes or reading journals, while others find themselves fascinated by these things, and that's okay. Soulsborne titles provide the best of both worlds. Judging by the trailer, it would seem that Mortal Shell takes a page out of FromSoftware's book here, by dropping the player into the middle of a strange world and letting them figure out the rest along the way. The challenge in these non-linear games is the likelihood of enemies becoming more and more difficult the further you get into the game. Because the world is open and players will likely choose the direction in which they travel arbitrarily, they have the potential of running into enemies that they are ill-equipped to fight in the game. This means that players must either backtrack entirely and try another route, or attempt to power through a boss they're unprepared for. While these games value increased stats, strength, and weapons, they are loved for players for one reason. Their fights are hard, but not impossible. In fact, if a fight is especially hard, it might not even necessarily be because a player is underpowered, but rather because they're missing a crucial slice of the puzzle. On the other hand, the boss may simply be strong, and players may be left without hope of leveling up adequately enough in any amount of reasonable time. Here, players are asked to utilize strategy in order to achieve victory. After playing against an enemy over and over again, players are left with ample opportunity to memorize their opponent's attack patterns and moves. Often, the player's counterattack must be timed at just the right time in order to defeat these enemies strategically, rather than just using brute force. Timing is truly everything in these games, as one missed button press can cost the player fights throughout the history of the Soulsborne games. Mortal Shell seems to have also taken inspiration from Sekiro Shadows Die Twice. This game introduced a posture system in which players would find it hard to break the defense of their enemies. Functioning like armor, when an enemy's posture is broken in Sekiro, they become extremely vulnerable. Players then have the opportunity to perform execution movements which deal massive damage to their weakened enemies. As shown in some of the early Mortal Shell footage that has been released, it seems a similar system is present in the game. The player is seen dealing large amounts of damage to their enemies, indicating that this strategic maneuver has been implemented in Mortal Shell as well. While Mortal Shell has been compared to FromSoftware's games across the board, it isn't the first in recent years, nor will it likely be the last. Just like Metroid and Castlevania set the precedent for platformers that would become globally known as Metroidvania, Soulslike is an emerging description for strategy-focused, difficult, and dark games that have emerged in the last few years. Even newer games such as Code Vein and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order have been grouped into this category by some, and with a slew of other games slated for 2020, being described by games journalists worldwide as Souls-like, it seems Soulborne games are on the rise. As all media seems to fall into trends, zombies one year and vampires the next, game developers worldwide seem to have taken notice of the Soulsborne momentum over the last few years. In 2020 alone, multiple Souls-like games have been announced. Hellpoint, Ader, Noi 2, and Hollow Knight Silksong among some. These are just a few of the other Souls-like games expected to be released along with Mortal Shell within the year, and it's clear that studios are not going to stop there. FromSoftware is even working to develop their new title, Elden Ring, enlisting the help of big-name Game of Thrones author George R.R. Martin to craft an entirely new epic fantasy world. While the game definitely takes inspiration from Dark Souls for combat, it does appear to put its own spin on what Dark Souls created. The gameplay released thus far has shown players will be engaging in unique combat moves unlike anything seen before in a Souls game. Truthfully, most game developers must take inspiration for their games from somewhere, and there aren't many gameplay styles out there that are not variations on a theme. From our initial impressions, Mortal Shell seems to avoid being a carbon copy of Dark Souls by taking inspiration and then innovating with their own gameplay, as great studios should. From what is known about games that embrace the Souls-like moniker, players can expect an extremely dark and unforgiving game from Mortal Shell. This has even been confirmed by the game developers themselves, stating that players must test their, quote, sanity and resilience in a shattered world. By the same token, the gameplay in Mortal Shell is described as strategic, deliberate, and unforgiving, and if that doesn't sound like a Souls game, nothing does. Devastating arcane powers are there for learning as players discover, defeat, and acquire more Mortal Shells. The deeper the player's connection to a Mortal Shell, the more a player will be able to glean from their former knowledge. While gameplay does seem difficult and strategic, this is likely not going to be a deterrent for players who are up to this sort of challenge, thanks to the bonuses awarded to them by advancing through the game. While the game is being developed by an entirely new studio, its core members are video game developer veterans who have worked on a variety of titles over the years. Because of this, the team remains small yet effective. Having started with just 4 members, the studio now claims to have roughly 15 people working on the game at any given time. While it is a comparatively large increase in employees for the studio, it's a small number of people to be working on such a fascinatingly large game. In fact, the trailers and gameplay shown so far give Mortal Shell the feeling of a big AAA game release, making this small number doubly impressive. To put the studio size into perspective, FromSoftware was reported as having roughly 288 employees in the year 2019. Games in this genre are typically massive, with impressive graphics and detailed combat systems in place. For such a small studio to produce such a detailed game is truly jaw-dropping. While absorbing the abilities of enemies a player has defeated in a video game is nothing new, Mortal Shell takes this process to an entirely new level, because players will essentially be trading one shell's abilities for another, players are able to effectively hop between classes available in the world. This is a huge breakthrough in gameplay, as even some games with the most advanced class systems typically do not allow players to switch between classes. It would seem Mortal Shell has found a clever and unique way to introduce this mechanic into their game, allowing for interestingly dynamic combat and customization. As players inhabit a shell, they begin to form a bond with it. Over time, players can become extraordinarily attached to their shells and gain more abilities. This, in effect, serves to act as the game's leveling or skill progression system. Because of this, hopping from one shell to another seems to temporarily be a detriment. It is clear that Mortal Shell works to incorporate classic RPG elements in a new and interesting way. Thanks to the unique shell mechanics the game has designed, each of these elements seems to fit into the core gameplay seamlessly. Players will be crafting upgrades, sharpening and maintaining their blades, and studying arcane abilities over the course of the game, simply because they are, quite literally, a shell that must learn everything there is to know. Did you like that video? Awesome. Go down below, hit the like button, and subscribe so you don't miss any more content like this. Hit the bell so you get notified for bonus points, and leave a comment if you have any questions or have something to say about Mortal Shell. We'll see you in the next video.